Well, so you can imagine when Baha'u'llah said no, he will not go, that he was a prisoner in that house. Abdul Baha could not insist. He could not say any more. But then he decided he better get somebody who is not a believer. He could insist. And so he went along and he saw the Mufti of Akka, which is the religious head of the city. And he was one of those great admirers of Baha'u'llah, this Mufti. A man by the name of Miri, he was Ali Miri. He was a very devoted person. He was really devoted to Baha'u'llah. Wasn't only an admirer, but he really became a worshipper, you can say, of Baha'u'llah. He had seen so many miracles, really, that man, in his life during that short period that Baha'u'llah was in Akka, that he once came to Abdul Baha and he said to Abdul Baha, he said, every time I stand to pray, Baha'u'llah appears in front of me. I pray to him. You see, this is how the influence of the power of God can change the hearts of people. And at first he was a great, I wouldn't say enemy, but he was a very difficult person. He was very much against the faith and the founder of the faith. And he met Baha'u'llah in the barracks of Akka, this man. And he was so proud that Abdul Baha kept on reminding him when he went to the presence of Baha'u'llah that he must change his attitude. And if ever he wanted to say anything, if this man wanted to say anything in the presence of Baha'u'llah, Abdul Baha would say, be quiet, don't say anything. You know, this is how he really enabled him to see gradually the greatness and the power of the faith. And then came a time that this Mufti of Akka became such an admirer of Abdul Baha that if he ever walked with him, he always walked behind the master, which is a very important sign in the East. If you walk with somebody, it depends who you are and who he is. If he is more important than you, you never walk in front of him. You always stay a step behind. And he always walked behind the master. And anyhow, this man came to Baha'u'llah and he said that, why aren't you going to this house outside Akka? And Baha'u'llah said to him that he was a prisoner. He would not go. And he said, he insisted. And he said, everything is ready. You are not a prisoner. No one can keep you a prisoner. And remember, the edict of the Sultan was still in force. The edict of the Sultan was still in force. But, and he said he will not leave Baha'u'llah. He just kept on, he clung to the hem of Baha'u'llah's garment, and he knelt before him. And he said, not until he accepts this leaving the house will he leave him. And so Baha'u'llah said, okay. And then, as you know, he went to the mansion of Mazra'e for the first time. And he went in that carriage. And Abdul Baha says, I took him there and I returned back to Akka myself. And so Baha'u'llah then spent mostly the months of summer and the months of when the weather was not very cold, in the springtime, sometime in the autumn, he spent in that house. But he often came back to Akka. You mustn't think that when he went into that house that he never came back. Oh no, he came back many a time to Akka. And after all, Abdul Baha was living in the house of Abud. The mother of Abdul Baha was living there. And the greatest holy leaf was living there at the time. And so he often came to the house of Abud. And then, as you know, this mansion of Bahji came into the picture. The mansion of Bahji was completed by the same man who owned the house, part of the house of Abud, a man called Udi Khammar. he finished, he completely finished. It was half-built building. Udi Khammar, he finished it up, and he made it a residence for himself. He wanted to move into this great palace in the outside of Akka. But as you know the details, how the outbreak of cholera took place and how Abdul Baha went along and rented that from him. And Baha'u'llah then moved into that. Now when he moved, he really did not move from the mansion of Mazra' into the mansion of Bahji. It happened that he was in Akka. When he left for the mansion of Bahji, he left Akka from the house of Abud to the mansion of Bahji. And it was just at the time that my father was in the presence of Baha'u'llah at that time as a pilgrim. And he said that when this building was rented by Abdul Baha, the believers went there along with Abdul Baha, and they washed the building with soap and water and everything else, because it is a marble building in the top part of it, and they washed it all and cleaned it for the coming that Baha'u'llah will come into it. And the first people who moved in were the family of Baha'u'llah, but not the mother of Abdul Baha or the greatest holy leaf or Abdul Baha himself. They did not move. And the reasons for it, now we don't go into it. Then, one day, it was known that Baha'u'llah is going to move to that mansion. And as you know, Akka in those days did not have any public lighting. The whole area was in the dark at night, absolutely dark. But some Baha'is of India had sent to Baha'u'llah a very unusually large lamp, oil lamp, oil, the wick, the oil. And this lamp was brought into the mansion, and it was put in the hall, and it was, you could see it from distance, a light shining in the mansion. So now this is the background to it. So one day Baha'u'llah was to go and move to this mansion. And my father and Nabil, both of them, were living in a little room in one of the streets of Akka. The street of Akka, called the Souq Abiyaz, means the white market. And when you live in that place, they had a window which was overlooking the road. And the only way that someone can come from the house of Abu to go into to go through the gate and go out of Akka is to pass in front of that house. And so they were standing behind the window, waiting just for a time that Baha'u'llah would be passing in front of their house, in front of their room. And they waited and waited until near sunset, before sunset. And then suddenly they saw that Baha'u'llah was then riding a donkey. It was very custom. This was the only way in those days. It was not the carriage, just a donkey. And behind was Baha'u'llah's servant, about 10 yards behind him. He was riding on his donkey. And the two passed in front of this room. And as soon as it passed and they saw him, Nabil said, "Let us go and follow them." So the two of them came out and they walked behind about 200 yards away, following Baha'u'llah. And when they reached the gates of the city, the guards showed their respects to Baha'u'llah, and he went out, and these two also went out afterwards. And soon it became dark, evidently, and then they could see, eventually they reached the point that they could see the light in the mansion. The ground for their cattle to eat. And one man went up one of these very tall trees, very, very tall. And when he went very, very tall, up went to the very top of it, suddenly he slipped a little bit and he fell down. Very high up, and he knew he's going to be killed. There's no question about it, falling from that height. At that moment, in desperation, in a fraction, in all this thing coming in a split second, he turned to God and he said, if you save me, I'll give all my cattle to you. All that I have, and that's all he had. All my cattle to you, for you. I don't want them. Please save me. And of course God heard him, and he said, okay, we will see what we'll test him. See, God always tests. He, instead of falling down on the ground, he fell on another branch. And he just hardly held himself. But it was, when he looked down, it was again dangerous. But it wasn't as dangerous as before. He was further down. So he again began to pray, please save me from here, he said. But he said, you know, last time when I was on the top of the tree, I said, I'll give all my cattle to you. I think it's not fair, he said, that I should give all my cattle to you. Really and truly, I think half of the cattle for you. And after all, I have a wife and family and children. You don't, what will you do with all the cattle anyhow? I'll keep half of it, and the other, you save me. I'll keep the half, and then you keep the other half. So God said, okay, we'll let him go down a little bit more. So this time he fell down, and he came down and he landed on another branch, which wasn't at all as high as the previous one. But still, he saw now if he falls down, he's not going to be killed. That's the danger of death is gone. So he said, you know, really, God, I was becoming very sentimental and carried away. I was really carried away. I think this is altogether an unfair situation. I mean, what will you do with, I have a wife, I have children, I've lived all these years, I've gathered these cattle, and now give you half of it. Really, what will you do with the half? Really, that's unfair. I was carried away, he said, when I was up there. I'll make a deal with you, he said. I'll have all the cattle, and you have all the milk and the cream. So God said, okay, that's all right, fair enough. And he let him drop down to the ground. And when he dropped down to the ground, he said to himself, what milk, what butter, oh no, you don't want it. Really, this was all unusual excitement on my part. You don't need it. Now you see, I said the story that now at this time in the history of mankind, we are now on the ground. Our foot is on the ground and we are safe. But a time will come, I can assure you, that we will be on the top. And then we are ready to give everything. And then it may not be just work out for us. This is what happened in Persia. Because the world conditions will really dramatically change. We talked, the world conditions will deteriorate with such speed now that it is going to bring about what Baha'u'llah has foreshadowed, the limbs of mankind to quake. Shoghi Effendi mentions, he says, the cities will burn, the atmosphere of the earth will be contaminated. And he said these are only either accompanying or will herald the coming of that great calamity which mankind must go through. He has written this. So that it is our really work and our privilege now to arise and serve the cause of God. And be sure of His assistance. He'll come to us if our motive is right. Well, I feel that you've had plenty of... you got tired. And we can go out, Mr. Chairman, have a cup of tea, and then we can come back again. But this time I will certainly deal with all the questions that you have left. I have them all in here. All right. Well, I am going to look at something which is... I suddenly thought of a little story, I'll tell you, because it's a good thing to know how this is to do with this, because somebody was mentioning to me during the break that gave me to... I felt that people think that to serve the faith, it means that you have to do something very, very big. All the big noises, join the big noise people like myself, for instance, which is not really serving the faith at all in relation to what other people can do. I can tell you that. Talking is nothing to do with the faith, with serving the faith. It could do something, but I feel that we must not think that to serve the faith you have to be responsible for a certain function, or you must be a person who yes, is a member of an assembly or a national assembly or a board member or anything like that. This has nothing to do with service to the faith. And another thing that I want to mention is that how much in the next life we will be amazed to find out that so many unknown people in this life, unknown in the way of public, not being in the public attention or in public eye, who will have such an exalted station in the spiritual worlds of God. And how many people like me who will be completely lost. Now, you know, this is true. This is really true. We must not ever attach importance to this, the people having a position, because nobody, as I said, has a station in this faith, really. We are all having a function. Yes, we have sacred functions. But this function is given, and God help the person who has been given a function. If he doesn't do his function well, it's much better if he was not given this function. You know, because service to the cause is when you make a cup of tea in your home with the love in your heart that you want the people to come into your home so that they could hear about the faith. That service, if it is done with the purity of motive, which is you do it for the love of God and for the love of Baha'u'llah and for the love of the people, that's much more meritorious than anything else, because God does not want from us more than we can do. But He wants us to do our best. It doesn't matter what we do. And in fact, the simpler one is, the better it is. The simple heart, the simple person. We have lost, I think, our simplicity in this modern civilization. If a soul is simple, God loves that simple soul. Always the simple soul has got he is the one who is going to benefit, and he'll receive all the rewards, because there's nothing worse than becoming sophisticated with modern way of life. And this modern way of life has really destroyed, most peoples of the world have been destroyed as a result of this modern civilization, which is eventually going to be destroyed and perished. The civilization that we have, it's a tottering civilization that Shoghi Effendi refers to it. So that, you know, we must not pay attention to these outward appearances of peoples and what they do. What is important to God is the heart of person, and how you feel the big things other people do and the big projects other people have. and all the things they do if it is not done to the best of their knowledge and ability. Now, the story which came to me is a story. I'll tell you two similar stories really. One is for during this period of Shoghi Effendi. I knew a man who was called Charles Dunning. I don't think any of you had met him. He was an Englishman. He was a man from Yorkshire. Some of you could read his account of his life in the Baha'i World, one of the volumes of the Baha'i World, in the Memoriam. He was illiterate. He hardly could write his name. He was if you looked at him, I don't want to describe it, what it was like physically. This man had such a pure heart and so frank, and none of these conventions that we are familiar with, none of these conventions he ever understood or carried it out. And yet he was the beloved of Shoghi Effendi. You know, Shoghi Effendi loved him so much, and he showered so much love upon him. Someone arranged for him to go. He was one of the Knights of Baha'u'llah. He went to the islands, the Orkney Islands, in the north of Scotland. And he taught the faith. He left behind him so much memories. But he was very frank, and the language wasn't what you would expect from a Baha'i sometimes. But this didn't mean anything, because the language which came out of him was purely from a very pure heart. You know, when he went to see Shoghi Effendi, when he went on pilgrimage, I'll just give you an example of the language. Shoghi Effendi so much loved this person, he always made him to sit at his right hand side at the table. He used to call Shoghi Effendi, who said, "Guardian, this is not right," he said. This is how he would talk to the guardian. "What you said is not right." He just had this. And once Shoghi Effendi said to him, "I have given some more plans to the British Baha'is. They are not going to like it." He said, "You are talking rubbish." Now, you know, this is the man. He didn't say rubbish. There was a slang which means rubbish. He says bunkum. Bunkum, guardian. And he didn't understand what bunkum means, and it meant rubbish. You're talking rubbish. Now I think, but now the love that Shoghi Effendi had for him had no bounds really. And he was such a simple man that he used to sign his name. He could only write his name, Charles Dunning. He would write down there KB after his name, means Knight of Baha'u'llah. You know, the British people who are knighted, they are usually called KBE. You know, they write down after name. These are the titles. And he always used to write his name, Charles Dunning KB. Well, it was always the same thing. Abdul Baha had so many disciples who were like this, and he loved them. There was a believer, now this is a believer, I never found his name, and we were told the story many times, but I failed to get the name from my father when he was telling us the story. But this person remains unnamed. But he was telling us the story that, you know, when people went to see Baha'u'llah, usually you wrote, you said you're coming, you got permission, you then would arrive in Akka, then the master, Abdul Baha, would arrange for you to stay in the pilgrim house for a few days, to rest, to settle down, to look at your clothes, to see if you had sufficient means, and then they would arrange for you to come into the presence of Baha'u'llah. But this man didn't know any of these things. He was such a simple soul. He started to travel from Yazd. He began the journey, and he walked all the way. He had nothing but a little bag on his shoulder. He was an elderly man, and he was going to see Baha'u'llah. He wanted to see his Lord. And he came to Akka eventually. Somehow he found his way. And he began to ask people where he can see the house of Baha'u'llah is. And they showed him the house. So he comes in. And he finds there are some stairs. He goes up the stairs. There was nobody around at the time. But then he hears a lot of people in the room. You know, Baha'u'llah was in this room. He just goes near the door. He puts his head through the door, looks around, and he says, which one of you are Baha'u'llah? This Baha'u'llah. And Baha'u'llah embraces him, showers so much love upon him. And then he says, bring tea for him. He says, no, that's trouble. Don't get into trouble. And after a few minutes, after an hour sitting there, he says, well, I think I better go, and not to cause any more difficult troubles, I'll go. You know, this is how, nobody would ever leave the presence of Baha'u'llah unless he would dismiss them, this is how it was. But this man was a simple soul. And this is what matters, really. Simplicity in our soul and in our heart. And that cup of tea that you make with love and with simple heart and with devotion, that is much more fruitful than all the things some others may do in the faith. Well, now there are some questions here. Somebody says, is this person who is your wife is not with you, right? What? She'll be here. Oh, you're taping it?
Yeah.
All right. This is a question. He says, could you speak on the process of the lesser peace, the emergence of the faith from obscurity, and the completion of the ark on Mount Carmel, and how these are related? This is quite a vast thing. She wants to know everything. She really wants to know everything. Well, I chose this question because it's a good question, and it will probably give us a little picture of the faith in the future. This is more or less the subject that we were discussing at the Dublin conference, international conference. That from the writings, and I have heard this is Pilgrim's Notes, but I have compared this Pilgrim Notes with the writings of Shoghi Effendi, and I found out that almost everything that is in this Pilgrim Notes, they are recorded in various parts of Shoghi Effendi's writings, that if you put them together, it'll tally with what Shoghi Effendi had said to this believer. There's only one or two things that I could not identify in the writings. And that is that, first of all, the lesser peace. As you know, the lesser peace, and this is not part of the Pilgrim Notes, I'll come back to it later. As you know, the lesser peace is a political peace. Baha'u'llah has said to Queen Victoria that if you, now that you have rejected the most great peace, which is a spiritual establishment of his world order in the world, now that you have rejected it, at least you should adhere and bring about a lesser peace, so that wars could be abolished. Now you see, we were talking yesterday about the creativity of the word. Because Baha'u'llah said this, we shall have a lesser peace. And if we don't want to have a lesser peace, we will be forced to have a lesser peace. You see now how the word of God is effective? We will be forced. Because man will come eventually to a point of recognizing that if he takes one more step, the whole world is going to be destroyed. And he says, that's enough. So the lesser peace will come. It will come at a point that mankind has really exhausted itself. And then he has no choice but to accept what Baha'u'llah has said. Now, those of you who were here, I was talking the story of the egg. You remember? The egg and the opening of the egg. The cause of God is now, the institutions of the faith now are in obscurity. I'm talking of the institutions of the faith. People do not know what our institutions are for. No matter how much you try to explain what is a local spiritual assembly doing, the generality of mankind does not appreciate it. In fact, we ourselves, as we were talking yesterday, may not appreciate it fully, of what the significance and the importance of these institutions are, that these are going to be one day the basis of the government for mankind. I'm not saying it's going to be necessarily the government, but they are going to have a great share. Who knows how they will develop and what they will do, these houses of justice. No one can say how these houses of justice will fit in to the running of the world, the management of the affairs of the world, how our national assemblies will fit into it, how the governments will fit into it. We cannot say these things. Nobody can ever foresee how these things will emerge. And the only way that Shoghi Effendi has described it to us, when they asked him, tell us what the unfoldment of the administrative order is going to be like, how will it shape up? He says two things will enable us to understand the unfoldment of the administrative order of Baha'u'llah and the emergence of his world order. Two things. One, he said, is the passage of time. You have to wait, in other words. And the other is the guidance of the House of Justice. Now, this is exactly the same in nature. If you, as I said, everything we have in the faith, you can trace it to nature. Now, in nature, you will find that anything which has an organic growth, say, for instance, a tree, example of a tree. The tree, once you plant the seed, you cannot ever say what this tree is going to be like until you give it time. Passage of time will tell you what this tree is going to look like, how big it's going to be, how many branches will it have. And the other thing, this is one element, the passage of time. And the other one is the laws of nature, which must be allowed to run through this whole process, to run this process of growth and development. The laws of nature must be allowed to work through this tree. And through these two elements, we can know what this tree is going to be like. Exactly the same thing here is with the development of the administrative order. Two things, the passage of time and the guidance of the Universal House of Justice for centuries maybe to come. Then we know what the world order of Baha'u'llah is like, how it will manage the affairs of the world, how it will run the affairs of the world, how all these institutions will come together to form a complete, a coherent system which will govern mankind. But at the moment, the faith is the institutions of the faith, local and national and international. They are in obscurity, and mankind does not know what they are for. Now, the time appears from the writings. It appears from the writings that when Baha'u'llah says that when the limbs of mankind have quaked, when it has really trembled, when the old order has been crumbled down, he says, then and only then, you see, these are his own words, then and only then will the divine standard be unfurled. In other words, then and only then people will recognize what we are saying and what we are having, what we are building. They are going to see, just like when the egg breaks up and opens up, you're going to see the new life emerging. And then people can see a new life. But that new life is just born. The institutions just have emerged. Nobody can say that once a child is born, he can immediately manage, he can immediately act as a grown-up person. You have to wait time for it to grow. Centuries has to wait, maybe. When the world order of Baha'u'llah, when the institutions of the faith emerge, in the words of Shoghi Effendi, the evolvement, he says, the evolvement, you see in one of his letters, the evolvement of local and national institutions, when that takes place, and he mentions when it will take place, I will talk to you about it now in a minute, the evolvement of Baha'i local and national institutions of the faith, it is just an emergency. Just people will see it. They can see what potentialities there are in it. But it cannot immediately take over now the affairs of the world and begin to rule the world. The institutions of the faith cannot do that. We have to have an interim form of government in the world, which would then, from the lesser peace onwards, could then manage the affairs of the world until such time that the world order of Baha'u'llah can then come in and take over gradually as time goes on. Now, Shoghi Effendi has given us a timing for this. In one of his letters he mentions that when the buildings on Mount Carmel, the building of the Ark, are completed and the world center of the faith begins to function, and which is quite a long way to go yet by the look of things. We have to build up more buildings, 3 more buildings, as you know. There are 2 buildings already built on the Ark, the Archives building and the building of the House of Justice around the Ark. But there should be 3 other buildings. One is for the study of the writings, which I understand will be built between the Archives and the House of Justice. And then the other 2 buildings, the International Teaching Center and the Public Library and the General Library, International Library. These 5 buildings then completed, and then the beautification of the gardens, the terraces to be made, the functioning of the world center of the faith, when they all begin to function. Shoghi Effendi says it will coincide with 2 things. One is the emergence of the lesser peace, and one is, as he puts it, the evolvement of both local and national institutions of the faith. Now, it is then that peoples of the world are able to at least appreciate, to some extent, what these institutions can do for the future of mankind. But as I said, it will take a long time for the world order of Baha'u'llah to come into being. Now, from here on, I'm going to describe this story of this pilgrim's note. And you must take, but as most of these points that I'm mentioning, or you can find it in the writings of Shoghi Effendi, here and there, put them together. You know that, now I'm not yet talking about that pilgrim's note. Let me give you a little bit more background to it. You know that the teachings of God, the social teachings of Baha'u'llah in this age, are such that the generality of mankind without being Baha'is, can and will put them into operation without knowing where they come from. This is the spirit of the age. And when this lesser peace is coming, Shoghi Effendi has said in this pilgrim's note again, which I haven't been able to identify, maybe our friend Ted can tell us if he's found anything, which he says that the lesser peace and the maturity of mankind are one and the same thing. The coming age of humanity, which Baha'u'llah refers to in his writings, and the lesser peace are one and the same thing. Now, I don't know. I haven't been able to find it in the writings, but this is the pilgrim's note. But from the signs, if you look at the signs of the coming of age of humanity, which Baha'u'llah has given us signs for it, you can believe this. You can accept this. Because Baha'u'llah have said in some of his tablets about the coming of age of humanity, a time that humanity will come of age, like a man who becomes 21. And he has given us 3 signs for it, Baha'u'llah. Now, this is in the writings. One is the establishment of a universal language. So you see, this is not very far away. It's not something which you can say it's going to be hundreds of years, but it is something which is round the corner, you can say, because the man is needing it more and more. The other sign is that kingship, the institution of kingship, will be such a discredited institution. It will be so discredited that people do not want to take on the burden of kingship, if you offer it to them even. Well, this has happened already. The discrediting of the institution of kingship. Kingship. Now, it does not mean that we Baha'is believe that there should be no kingship in the faith, in the future. In fact, this is one of the teachings of Baha'u'llah. He says God would prefer, God likes to see a system of kingship coming into being, rather